Welcome back to Well, What Do You Know? And to part 2 of my conversation with Jerry Power of Moravia, Iowa. In our last episode, Jerry shared powerful stories of growing up in southern Iowa, heading off to Vietnam, and the heartbreak of losing his mother while he was serving overseas. In this episode, Jerry picks up where he left off, reflecting on starting his own business, the people who shaped his path, his marriage to Judy, and the unforgettable experience of taking an honor flight to Washington, D.C. It's another chapter in a life full of resilience, faith, and community, and I'm so glad you tuned in to hear it.
Then, let's see, I got stationed in Austin, Texas, and stayed there from, I still hate Longhorn football. Them and the Cowboys. Yeah. I just hate them both, you know. But anyhow, we stayed there till May of '71. I actually worked at a gas station, and I made as much money at that gas station at night than I did in the service.
Really?
Because we wanted some stuff, and so as soon as I get off work there at 4:30, I'd manage the gas station. Have you ever taken a lie detector test?
No, I haven't.
I have. I was kind of the night manager there, and I always had some high school kids working. And a gas war was going on top of it. Solid cars from 5 o'clock till we closed at 9. All we did was check oil, wash windshield, and fill it up with gas. Gas got down to 12.9 cents a gallon. So anyhow, the manager, he had, I don't know, there were 26 of these gas stations in Austin, Texas.
Right.
And he had like 7, 8, 9 of them. He was a retired master sergeant. He comes in when I started the shift. He says, "I want you to take a lie detector test." I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, you need to take a lie detector test." I said, "Okay." I said, "What's going on?" I said, "Somebody stealing?" He said, "Yeah, somebody's stealing money." You know, because it was all cash.
Right.
Credit card a little bit. Most of it's cash. Anyhow, they set a lie detector test downtown. I went down there. The guys I still remember him asking a question. He said, asked me who I was and where I lived and how long you been here, and have you ever taken anything from the station? And I said, "Yeah." He said, "What'd you take? Take money?" I said, "Yeah, I took some money." He said, "How much did you take?" I said, $10. He said, "Why $10? I said, "I left it in my pocket when I closed the station, and we put the money in a floor safe, and I dumped it in there, except I had that $10 bill." He said, "What'd you do with the $10 bill?" I said, "What do you mean, what did I do with it?" I said, "I took a bag and put it in the cash." "Did you take anything else?" "Yeah, I took a chamois." "You took a chamois? Why'd you take a chamois?" I said, "Because we cleaned the windows we'd put water on them, and we'd take a chamois and wipe it off.
Right.
When they get holes in them, we throw them away." So I asked him, I said, "Can I have one of those?" I said, "There's still some good use, you know, we can chamois the car up." "Anything else?" I said, "Oh yeah, one other thing." "What was that?" I said, "Pop." He said, "You took pop?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Why'd you take the pop?" He said, "Because they told us we could." I said, "Write it down as a discount." It was like 10 cents a can or something, 20 cents, I don't remember. But I said, "Write it down as a discount and just drink it. You can have one a night, but that's it." So, "You wrote that down?" I said, "Yeah." So anyhow, got all done. He says, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "Yeah, what?" He said, "Would you be willing to take this again?" And that's what I did. I started laughing. I said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah, I'll do it again." I said, "You think I'm lying?" He said, "I don't know." I said, "Well, shoot the questions." I said, "You're going to get the same answers, because that's what I know." So I get out of there. I go down and go to work. I got off service a little early so I could do that. Told them what I had to do. And it was like having a job in Texas. Right. I mean, 8 to 5 or 8 to 4, 8 to 4:30. I'm in there, and back then the gas tanks were under the license plate, and so I was bent down pumping gas in this vehicle, and this Roland Black, this manager of the 7 or 8 or 9 stations, says, I'm down here pumping gas, and he comes and pecks you on the shoulder. He says, I guess I'm going to have to ask for your time. I turned around and I said, what? And he got a big grin on his face. He said, I knew it wasn't you. But he was going to fire me, so I'm going to ask for your time, you know.
Yeah. So he had every one of his employees, and if they refused, then they were probably fired, right?
Yeah. And so I said, it was Jimmy, wasn't it? He grinned, and he said, I better not answer that. I said, I just knew it. I said, this kid's full of crap. And I said, he come in here one night, and his eyes were he was acting silly. And I said, I knew he wasn't drunk, and I realized he'd been smoking marijuana.
Yeah.
This was been in 1970 or 71. And he said, it was Jimmy, wasn't it? He said, I won't answer that. I said, that's good enough answer. So anyhow, I got out of the service in 71 and came back home, and I went back to school 2 or 3 times to get that degree. I had 80-some hours and had a GI Bill. I was divorced in 75, and then Judy and I got married in 76, and she had a good job at the clerk of court. She was first deputy at clerk of court. She had a good job. I had the GI Bill, and I was in personnel, and I hated it. I loved the people. I enjoyed being around the people, but fought unions, fought management, and I thought, I'm not doing this anymore. So I applied for a job at Great Plains Bag Company. I didn't want to move to Des Moines, but my salary then was like $15,000, which wasn't bad. And I went to work for a guy. The plant closed, and they wanted me to move to Missouri, and I didn't want to. So I stayed around. I went to work for a guy in Ottumwa, Ed Everco, personnel guy. I was making $15,000 a year, and this job in Des Moines paid $35,000.
Oh wow!
And there were 35 applicants for the job, and I made the top 5, and I was the first guy in line. The first thing out of the guy's mouth was, he asked me questions about personnel, and I rattled as to I knew what I was doing.
Right.
EEOC, employment, equal employment for everybody, and OSHA, and I knew all that stuff because I did it every day. The next question was, he said, I see you don't have a degree. I said, so I thought to myself, that's not going to happen again. A buddy told me that worked for this same guy over there. He said, I hear you're going to work over for Howard Bertram over at Everco. I said, yeah. He said, you won't last 6 months. I looked at him. I said, I can tolerate anybody. He said, I guarantee you can't tolerate that guy. He was right. 6 months later, I was out of it. I went back to school full time. When I got out of school, Eric, I went back to school full time. I had an excellent. He was head of the business department at Northeast Missouri. His name was Robert Dager, and he got me in classes. I went Monday, Wednesday, Friday. He lined them up. I'd go from 7:30 to 1:30. I had 18 hours that last semester to get out. I've never used a degree.
Really? What was your degree in?
Business administration.
Okay. But you don't feel like you've used it here running your own?
Oh, yeah, but as far as it's not been something that you have a degree.
Oh, I understand.
Yeah, no, yeah. I didn't. It was just, and I know, people say, well, but you have to be persistent to get that degree.
Right.
It's not like you're smarter than anybody else.
Right.
I've met a lot of guys that had 8th grade educations that were smarter than me, but that was one of the things, just because you got a college degree, it doesn't mean you're smart.
No.
We know people like that.
For sure we do.
So anyhow, I got a part-time, full-time job at Farm and Home in Centerville. I'd get home, I have my homework done. That's the only time in my life I ever made the dean's list.
Yeah.
So we get home and I'd be antsy, and she'd say, "You need to get a job." I said, I'll get one. There are not very many jobs. I said, I can find a job tomorrow. And so I went out to Matco. Do you remember Matco?
I do remember Matco.
And Gibson's.
Yeah.
They would have hired me on the spot. So when I was in personnel, I had the gal at Job Service, Ethel Dara, who did our taxes. She was a great lady. She said, I called her, I said, hey, can you find me a decent job? She said, why don't you go to Farm and Home? They're looking for somebody. So I go out there. Well, Well, no, I'm not getting ahead of myself. So I went out there, and it was a guy by the name of Forrest Curtis. He was the manager. And Dick Gale owned the store, and he and Sam Walton were buddies at the University of Missouri. Well, a guy was buying in. His name was Larry Parks, so I interviewed with him. And so anyhow, I talked to him, and Forrest and I hit it off pretty good. He was he owned the Easter Super Value was where Aldi's was when it came to town, and he was a manager. So I thanked him, and I went home, and I no more got home, the phone rang. Can you come back out here? I said, yeah. So I went back out there, and we want you to meet Dick Gale. So I went up there and met him, just a multi-millionaire.
Yeah.
He's just a great guy. His son Bill and I played Little League Baseball together, and he got killed in a car accident when he was in college. Anyhow, they told me, then he came back downstairs, and he was up in the office, and they came back downstairs, and they said, here's what we want you to do. I said, what's that? He said, I told him, I said, I can work Tuesdays, Thursdays, and weekends all day, okay? Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I can be here maybe about 2:30. Okay, here's what we want you to do. We want you to close on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I said, what? We want you to close the store. I said, okay. We want you to open up on the weekends. Work Sundays 1 to 5. So I said, okay. So anyhow, I said, okay. I said, when do you want me to start? Tomorrow? Yeah, can you start tomorrow? I said, yeah, I can start tomorrow. So I start to walk up. I said, don't you want to know how much you're going to get paid? I said, I really don't care. I said, my wife said I had to find a job. So that's all I'm going to do. That's all I'm doing here. And I said, she didn't think I could find a job. And I said, I knew I could find a job.
Right.
So anyhow, wages were like $2 an hour everywhere back there. We're going to start you at $4.50 an hour. I said, what? I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, you're going to open, close, and the whole bit. So, all right. So I did. I went home, got home. I said, found a job. He said, no, you didn't. I said, yeah, I did. I said, I'm working at Farm and Home. You know, I worked there 2 different times, actually. So, anyhow, I did that. And so I went back to school, finished the degree, got out. And as I was on the floor one day, this guy walks in. His name was Sam Sweden. Sam Sweden bought the Chevrolet dealership there. And Sam and I, he was 3 years older than me, but we were friends. We played baseball against each other, but we knew he was just a great guy. He walks up to me and he says, hey, he said, Richard Shepard said that you're going to get out of school before long, right? And I said, yeah. He said, what are you going to do? I said, well, I'm going to get into sales somewhere. I said, I'm not getting back in personnel. I said, I'm not doing that anymore. I said, fighting the union, fighting employees, and fighting management. I said, no. And I said, I had an understanding wife that said, when I told her I was going to quit personnel, she didn't even bat an eye. She just said, okay, if that's what you want to do. But anyhow, he says, I got just the job for you. I said, really? He said, well, you know I bought the dealership out there. I said, yeah. He said, I want you to be a finance and insurance man. I said, okay. I said, when they sell a car, they come to you. And then you finance the car, you sell them credit life on their life and accident and health in case they get sick and they can't make the payment. He said, I'll guarantee you'll make $15,000 a year. He said, I'll give you a demo to drive, and I'll give you commission. If you sell rust proofing or whatever, car warranty or whatever, he said, I'll give you so many dollars. I made almost $24,000 that first year.
Wow.
So there I went from that about, a year and 4 or 5 months, he comes to me. And this guy is the best salesman I've ever been around. He just is. And he died in December a couple of years ago. I drove out to South Bend, Indiana, just to go to the funeral. So he said, he comes to me one day, he said, I need to talk to you. He said, the farm economy's hit, and we're going to have to close. He said, I don't want you to tell anybody. He said, I'm going to push you out of here. I said, all right. He said, I know a guy in Des Moines that they sell rust proofing to car dealers. You know? I said, okay. So interviewed, and the guy was a good guy and the whole bit. And so I went to work. I called on car dealers. This is walking into somebody that you don't even know and ask them to buy something. It's a tough job. So I did that and did pretty well the first year, but the second year I was really doing pretty well too, and I traveled all of Iowa and part of South Dakota. But I was gone, and Julie was born in 79. So this would have been in 80 and 81. I financed cars through GMAC. It's Ollie now, Allie. And then Centerville National Bank and Iowa Trust and Savings Bank. So I was selling rust proofing. The kids had Julie, and Jared was coming along too, you know. And I'll never forget, I called on this big dealer up in Waterloo, and I just got up there. I drove 3 hours to get up there to give him some service. And the parts manager was a guy that he was pretty matter of fact most of the time, and he talked, but he didn't, you know, he was always busy. He said, you need to go back home, your wife's going to the hospital. I said, okay, all right, thanks so much. And he said, well, here's an order for you while you're doing it. So that's when Jared was born. So anyhow, I got to know Larry Pyatt and Bill Benz at Iowa Trust and Savings Bank, and I knew some of the guys at Centerville National too, but they weren't as easy to get along with as Iowa Trust or GMAC was in Des Moines. See, I'd have to call them, and they'd run credit checks on people. So one day, Larry Pyatt, did you know him by any chance?
No, I don't think I did.
He was a VP at Iowa Trust, him
Okay.
and Bill Benz. And the owner of the banks who I interviewed, and Eric, he's in the top 5
Right.
of it. Even though I made him mad when I left, but I'll get to that in a second. So anyhow, Larry Pyatt calls me. He said, hey, he said, would you be interested in coming to work at the bank? So still the sales, I'm thinking sales, you know. I said, doing what? He said, selling insurance. I said, I don't know about that. I said, I'm not sure. He said, well, why don't you come and talk to us anyway? I said, all right. So I go and talk to Brad Young, who's the owner of the bank, just a multimillionaire, just a great human being. And we'd talk, and so I ended up doing it. And I worked in the bank down here when I moved here. Well, I didn't move here. I drove. It was January 1st of 82, and then we moved up here in August of 83. So that's just those contacts got me that job. Well, I worked at it a couple of years. Brad called me one day, and he says, after the second year, and he said, can you come over? Let's talk about what we want to do. So I go over there, and his office is in the basement. And he said, so we sat down, and he was easy to talk to. I mean, he just, you know, he said, we're going to move there. A bank couldn't have an agency in a town that had more than 5,000 people in it. But he said he got around it somehow. He said, I'm going to move the agency to Centerville. And we moved, it already moved to Moravia, see? So I thought, okay. So anyhow, the second thing he said was, and our agreement was salary plus commission, just like with Sam Sweden. Mm-hmm. But after I got that job at ECP selling rust proofing, there was no guarantee. They guaranteed me $600 for 6 months. That was it.
Then it was straight commission.
Straight commission. That's, if you don't sell anything, you don't make anything.
Right.
So anyhow, he says, and he started me at 18,000 plus commission when I started in January of 82. And then he said, I'm going to give you a good salary. He said, take you off commission. So I said, okay. I said, I'm going to have to think about that. And I said, what about a car? He said, well, none of my VPs have a car. I said, how am I going to go around and see people? He said, we'll work that out. I said, okay. I go home. I walked through the garage into the kitchen, and she took one look at me and she said, "What's wrong?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Something's wrong." I said, "Well, Brad just told me he's going to put me on salary." I said, "I ain't going to do that." I said, I can do it. I can do it for them. I can surely do it for myself. We started an agency from scratch.
Yeah.
I come down 19 steps every day, several times.
Yeah.
And you hit the bricks, or, you know what it's like. You've done some of it.
Yeah. You started the agency out of your home then, didn't you?
Yeah. And see, when I did that, they wanted me to get one of the houses in Westview
Oh, sure.
just for show purposes.
Right.
I mean, they're good people, all of them.
Right.
But anyhow, I thought, that parlor would make an excellent office. Should I? There's no, you can do whatever you want to in Moravia, Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
There's no laws that says you can't. So I did, and so it worked out. I got a couple of companies to go with, and I was out every day. I mean, I was out. And I had written quite a bit of business for them, the
Right.
people that I knew, And speaking of Brad Young, he asked me for some advice. I gave him what my opinion was, and we had a little disagreement over something else later on, and so anyhow, we kind of parted ways. And we're still friends and all, but I wondered how he felt about me. Well, about a year later, I found out how he felt about me. I was in the Owl Pharmacy in Centerville, and I picked up something, maybe a birthday card or something, and I was getting ready to walk out the door. And who was walking in the front door but J. Brad Young. And I thought to myself, I thought, okay, here we are, He took one look at me and got a big grin on his face, and he said, "Jerry Power, how in the hell are you?" And he stuck his hand out and shook my hand, and Eric, I melted. I melted right there. I said, this guy, if you can picture the perfect businessman who has a very nice sport coat on, a shirt and a tie, well groomed. He was an astute businessman. He was a great banker. He grew the bank, and to have him, he was always on my level. I mean, he had some money, and you would never know it talking to him.
Yeah.
And so I felt so relieved because as I told you the other day, he was one of my top 5 that influenced my life, and I will never ever forget him. So
You've mentioned a lot of people so far. If you could pinpoint it, who's the one person that has had the most impact on you and who you are today?
Judy.
Yeah.
She's always, well, other than my mom, she put up a lot of crap for me, and it was tough growing up, money-wise, but we always had something to eat. I forgot to mention, I come home from basketball practice, my hair would be froze,
Right.
No big deal. And there'd always be something in the oven. She'd have supper waiting for me,
Right.
But let me just run down a little bit of list. My brother that was 3 years older than me, he had a good influence on me. We got into it a few times, but when he died, we went down to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and he told me that he loved me. He'd never done that in his life. He'd never done that, But my mom, my sister always called people. Jeff Graves told me one time, said, they go to the Catholic Church. He says, "I met your sister." I said, "Really, Barb?" I said, "Isn't she something?" He said, "Yeah." And my wife said, "If I could be like anybody, it'd be like your sister." My sister was great. But anyhow, my mom, Judy. I learned from my kids.
Yeah.
There's a guy by the name of Paul Johnson. Have you ever heard of Paul Johnson? Well, the football field in Centerville?
Yeah.
You know what it's called? Paul Johnson Field. Paul Johnson was my high school principal. 700 kids there. He could walk down the hall and call them by name. That's the way teachers are. You know that. Paul Johnson, my mom, Judy. There's people that had more faith in me than I had myself.
Right.
I'll just bring up one, a guy by the name of Frank Cortesio. He was my junior high teacher, high school teacher, and junior college teacher. He was also my freshman basketball coach. John Elliott he picked 6 kids when they were 15 years old in Babe Ruth. We played probably 20 ball games. It was an all-star team, but there was no such thing back for Babe Ruth. A guy by the name of John Elliott coached us. He came and got 2 players off the other teams and added them to his team. We went to Washington. We went to Oskaloosa. We went to We played Eddyville 5 times one year. Beat them 4 out of the 5 times. I pitched and caught both. One game up at Oskaloosa. I'm getting way off the subject, but I pitched the first game against Oskaloosa and beat them. I'll never forget it, beating 5-2. And those Oskaloosa kids, my ears stuck out, and they kept calling me Rabbit. I thought, just made me throw that much better,
Right.
After the game, this one kid comes up to me and he lays in the grass with me and starts,
Yeah.
We had a good conversation. He ended up being an attorney over in Keokuk, I believe. But yeah, John Elliott put me in the second game. Guess where he put me? Behind the plate. After the 3rd inning, I looked at it. I said, I'm drained. I said, I could barely move because I pitched 7 innings that first game and then come back and caught the second game. He had more faith in me than I had myself. Right. I didn't think I was that good a catcher. But we played a tumble one night in Centerville, and he brought me in relief in the last inning. And Tumble had some sticks, and first guy up struck the first 2 guys up in the 7th inning. 3rd guy drove it straight up in the air. I mean, so I waved everybody off, and I caught the ball and didn't think anything about it. We won, beat them 8-2 or something like that. And Frank Cortese, I go through, back then, the dugouts were all wire,
Right.
2x4s and stuff. And I go out, and he comes running up. He was my junior high teacher. He comes running up to me and grabbed me by the hand. He said, "The Cardinals ought to sign you right now for $20,000. I'll never forget that.
Yeah.
I thought, really? It was, Sam Sweden, he had he believed in me. Let's see, Brad, my mom, Judy, kids, Paul Johnson, Sam Sweden, the car dealer, Brad Young, the banker. I think I covered most of those, but my older brother was like a big brother and a dad.
Yeah.
He died of cancer, and I traveled then, and I was able to go to Davenport about every other week. He was living in Moline, and so I'd go there, and I'd get there, and he'd hand me a 20. He said, "Go get us some beer." His wife didn't like him drinking beer, but he drank it anyway. And so I said, "I don't want your money." I said, I'll go get some beer. So we drink beer together.
Yeah.
Every time I go up there, and I came up there one time, and they'd already taken a lung out, and he's over there smoking. I said, I looked at him, I said, "Smoking, huh?" And he said, looked at me, he says, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. And I've smoked all my life, and I ain't quitting. I said, "Hey, I don't blame you one shred."
Yeah.
Oh, a guy by the name of Delbert Engel. Forgot Delbert. I hung around his garage. Delbert Engel, this may sound crazy to you, but I got to know him through a buddy. But anyhow, he was 10 years older than me. It was Walter Paris's brother-in-law. So I couldn't leave him out of that mix either, because I hung around his garage, and I got grease on my hands a lot of times and helped him do stuff and learned some stuff. But I live in junior high. I would walk home. I'd go through the city park. It was about a mile to my house. I'd change clothes, and then I would walk clear over to where close to Lincoln School, another mile, and help him in the garage, just doing stuff. He didn't pay me or anything. I just hung around the garage, and he was just, there are so many people. Some people who didn't even know they helped me just by saying or do something. A lot of classmates, a lot of friends that I had that some of them gave me some great advice. A couple of them would tell me to do stuff when I do something wrong. They say, you need to do it the other way. Here's what you need to do. But, Gerald Thomas and Tommy Anders were two of those guys. But, there's people around like Tom Hoff, and I played catch in Babe Ruth games. He passed away a year ago in December. And he was a good friend. And, some of these people were always on my side. Jerry Angren, Frank Caraccio, Rick Matthews. Rick Matthews is one great individual. Ronnie Clark, Larry Shondell, my buddy Dave Spillman helps me put flags up. Kenny Robertson. I have I mentioned the preacher, Claire Vallejos. And he and a fellow by the name of Tom Sager were the two smartest guys in the class. And Tom Sager is now a division head at he's a business division head at the University of Texas in Austin, Texas.
Those Longhorns you love.
Yes. And my grandson, he's visited about half a dozen business schools, and he lives in Columbia, Missouri. Well, anyhow, I called Claire Vallejos. I said, "Do you have Tom Sager's number?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Can you give it to me?" So I called Tom and told him what I was doing. And Tom he was a professor. He was a doctor. Mm-hmm. I think he even taught at Berkeley. I'm not sure. But anyhow, I called him and asked him, and he said, "Would you take him on a tour of the campus?" He said, "When they coming?" And I said, "I'll have to get back with you on that." And he did, and I've got pictures of them together down there. But anyhow, just like that, all those guys, and I'm sorry I missed some people, but it was back then we just stood up for each other. These guys are all my classmates, and some of these people I've gone to school since kindergarten, and we're still friends. That's been some of them 74 years ago.
So you've talked about a lot of people, and obviously a lot of people have had an influence on your life, but you are focused completely on, it seems to be, you're focused completely on people that just made time for you, like that tour at the business school. All that person did was make time for you. That seems to be a pretty big theme for you.
It is, because some of them don't even know what they did for me.
Right.
Jerry Angren, for example. Whenever somebody would say, "Where's Powers at?" And he'd always say, "Who? Powers, where's he at?" He said, "I don't know who that is." He said, "It's Power, P-O-W-R, Power." He'd correct him.
Yeah.
He was just like that. And they, just the kind word, just, like John Elliott picking me and another kid off our team to go play All-Star. I had a guy by the name of Char Wood, and he ran the local Brown Shoe Fit store. And he came to my house we lived in a pretty bad house. He came down, and he lived on Drake Avenue, great guy. I delivered his papers when I was a kid. He came to my house and he said, "I wondered if you'd be able to come to work for me in the store." I said, "Well, I'm working in the Quad Cities during the week." I said, "But Saturday's okay, maybe this fall at school?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, come in sometime, we'll talk about it." So just like that. And people would, nothing more than be nice to me.
Right.
Right. And they don't know what they did for me. And, guys like Gerald and Tom, I've told Tom to his face, Tom Anders, he's an attorney in Centerville. And I've told Tom, I said, Tom, I said, you helped me grow up. I said,
Yeah.
we're the same age, but you helped me grow up. I said, I appreciate that.
This episode of the Well, What Do You Know podcast is brought to you by P Squared Design, where your memories become keepsakes. Imagine this: Grandma's voice reading a bedtime story, even when she's miles away. At P Squared Design, we record those special moments, like grandparents reading to their grandkids, and turn them into lasting treasures. We create a beautiful bookmark with a QR code that, when scanned, plays that recording anytime, anywhere. It's story time, on demand, with the people who matter most. Visit psquareddesign.com to explore our work and start creating something unforgettable. That's psquareddesign.com. P Squared Design. Your story, your voice, your keepsake.
Welcome back to Well, What Do You Know? We'll pick up right where we left off with Jerry Power. You mentioned Judy a couple of times. Tell me how you met her.
Well, it's kind of funny, really. I had known her. I'd known who she was. My brother-in-laws at the time were good friends with her younger brother. So I knew who she was, and she knew who I was. And actually, she worked for the clerk of court, and that's where I first saw her. I hadn't seen her for years. So anyhow, we were up at the Chamber of Commerce office. I was with a gentleman by the name of John Roods. John Roods was one of the sharpest guys I've ever been around. He was the vice president of manufacturing for McGraw Edison Products. There are 8 plants in Iowa, Missouri, and Arkansas. John was one of the smartest guys I've ever met. Well, we went into the chamber office just to let the chamber know that everything was going on, and we're doing good and the whole bit. And so we went out and stood on the street corner and kind of walked around there a little bit. And we had union negotiations still going on. We met at a motel. We rented the lower floor of one of the big rooms, and we were talking about this, that, and the other, and he looked at me and he said, "You need to get married." I said, "What?" He said, "You need to get married." He said, "I think you'll feel a lot better." I said, "Okay, well, yeah, okay." So anyhow, about that time, Judy walks down the street, and so I knew who she was because I dealt with her at the clerk of court, and I spoke to her. She spoke back, and so she went on down the street. She was on a lunch break, as I recall, and John Roods looked at me and he says, "Oh, what's wrong with her?" And I said, "Well, probably nothing." He said, "Did you see the way she looked at you?" I said, "Well, yeah, she spoke and that sort of thing." I said, he says, "I don't think it was a different look." I said, "Okay." So that's how it got started. I thought, John Roots is a very smart man. We'd go out to eat. We'd go to the Pale Moon or the Green Circle or Al's Cafe in Seymour. And he would start telling jokes, and they were all great jokes. Some of them dirty jokes, but he knew a lot of them. He was just a super smart individual. But I followed his advice, and I called Judy, and our first date, and I could tell you what we had. We had black olive and green olive pizza at Shakey's in Ottumwa. It was a great place to eat pizza. We went over there a couple times, and we dated, and we did some things. I went to her family reunion. They had one at Lake Wapello, and we got to know each other pretty good. And I found out that she was very smart, up to date, and so I asked her to marry me the next year. So
You talked a lot about your service in Vietnam. Thank you for your service, obviously.
Thank you.
A buddy of mine has organized several honor flights. Did you ever take part in the honor flight?
Absolutely did. I just I applied for it and just kind of forgot about it for a while. And all of a sudden, I saw one was coming up, so I applied again, and I got to go. It flew out of Cedar Rapids, and I could take a caretaker with me, so I picked Josh to go with me to be my caretaker, even though I didn't need it.
Right.
And so we went up to Cedar Rapids about 3 months prior to the flight to determine what they were going to do. They gave us a shirt and a hat and the whole bit, and so they told us what. And we went up in October, about, I think it was 3 years ago. We went up and stayed overnight. Got up the next morning and got on. They served us breakfast. They had rolls and different things, and we met at the airport, and we got on a plane, and they told us what all was going to happen. It was a 24-hour trip, and so
The entire trip was 24 hours?
24 hours.
Really?
24 hours. And
Wow.
we got to Washington D.C., and who was there to meet us but Chuck Grassley. He met the Iowa flight, and we talked to him. I talked to him, and he was just very cordial. He took pictures of us. Then we toured my favorite, of course, the one I've been to the Vietnam Wall 7 or 8 times in my life. It's always a moving experience. But we went to we met at the World War II monument, which is quite the place.
Beautiful.
Yeah, have you been there?
Yes, I have.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Korean, and we saw the nurses, and we saw the Vietnam statues. And by the way, there are statues in Albee, Iowa of the same thing. But anyhow, we went through there, and they served us lunch, and we saw a Marine drill team with rifles, and that was amazing. And Josh and I sat there, and he was supposed to be a caretaker for somebody else, but luckily, he said he wanted a nurse. This guy was. So anyhow, a nurse came up and took over for Josh, and Josh was somewhat relieved.
Yeah, right.
And so we got to do most of it together, and bought a few souvenirs. And the last place we went, they served us supper, and I don't remember. I'll have to think about what they served us. It was a box lunch at the Air Force Memorial. And we went to the Marine Memorial, and the highlight was when we got back on the plane ready to come home, they put us on buses. They bussed us everywhere. There's 5 buses. And we got on the airplane, and these people from Eastern Iowa Honor Flight had contacted my family. They contacted every family and asked them to write something and send it to them. And they did, and all these people, they had this in a pouch in a brown manila envelope. Later on, we got a hardbound book that had all the pictures in it. We went to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and somebody from Iowa got to put the wreath on.
Oh. That's at Arlington, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Phenomenal.
Yeah, and there's it's just an eerie feeling, all this. And we saw a couple of burials there. They bring the horse and the carriage out with the casket on it. It's just a neat deal. When we finally got back on the plane again, they started giving us this stuff, So we got back into Cedar Rapids at about 9:30 that night. And we came on home, but when we got to the airport, there was first people I saw were some highway patrolmen. They were all in full dress. So I just walked past them. I said, "You guys know Chris Spencer or Clayton Daniels? You know those guys?" And the one guy says, "Yeah, I went to school with them, the police academy." I said, "Well, that's where I'm from." And I didn't think anything about it. I just thought they were there, And then you know, county mounties, full dress, fire were there, fire people were there. We get up on the main concourse, and there's anywhere from 400 to 1,000 people up there. And you know, when most of us came back from Vietnam, I came there was nobody at the airport.
Right.
Of course, you know, I was just me and my wife and daughter, which I already said about. But all these people were there, and they all gave us a welcome home. They said, "Welcome home." And this one little girl, I wish I'd have taken a picture of her, but I didn't. She gave a key ring. One of the ribbons that we wear was Vietnam campaign. It's green and yellow and another color. And she had made key rings with little beads on them to match that. And I've still got that.
Every time I open Facebook, it seems like you're putting flags up or taking flags down, or talking about memories of coaching kids, or and even kids that weren't your own, right? I mean, you coached your own kids, I know that,
yeah.
but you also coached the generation before that.
Well, a couple of things, you know. And when Jill was 9 years old, she got coached in the girls' league over in Centerville. There was 10 teams in the league over there, and 2 new coaches came in when Jill was 10. It was 10 to 13. Mm-hmm. Sam Sweden Motors sponsored the first one. Okay, and we had a draft and had picked players, and I had 14 kids. 13 of them were 10 years old, and we're playing in a 10 to 13-year-old league.
Right.
And that first year, we practiced all the time. If we weren't playing, we practiced. We were 0-19.
Yeah.
0-19. And one of the moms on one of the better players went to the league lady, Rosemary Porter, and says, "What are we going to do about him?" She said, "What do you mean?" So if they haven't won a game, I said, "What do you expect? They're all 10 years old." Here's what happened the second year. We used to go behind Pomida, where Lion is now. They're on 8. There was a ball field back there. We practiced. We practiced all the time. I'm a practice person.
Right.
The second year, I had two girls that pitched. Neither one of them were super fast, except one just slingshot, and the other one semi-windmill. Something clicked. You know, I kept telling them, "You're going to get better. You're going to get better. You got to do this. You got to do that." They were silent. Mm-hmm. When they got to high school, 5 of the 7 starters were on my team out of a 10-team league. 5 of the kids, the whole infield was my kids.
Right.
So, second year, we lost, 4 or 5 games in a row. And then we won like 15 straight. We played against one team when those kids were 11 years old. The whole infield were 13-year-olds. They looked like grown women.
Right.
We kicked their butt. Second year, they end up 16-5 and won the league tournament. The next year, and this is a crazy thing, the next year, I had one coach that said, you know, they thought they were pretty good. Mm-hmm. And I got those kids together, and they're like this. Mm-hmm. I said, "Nobody gets past second base." Did you hear what I said? Nobody gets past second base. Skunked them, 21-0. We get to let's see, that was the second year. We had the streak going, 16-7. Then the third year we were like 19-0. Got into the league tournament. We were in the bottom of the 6th inning. We were down 4 runs. I said, "We're screwed." You know, it's just one of those things. There's no way we're going to get 5 runs.
Right.
This girl comes up. She was younger. She hadn't played much. First swing of the bat, she hit it between first and second, got on base. And the next thing you know, and Jill scored the 15th run, and I beat her at home. The other coach looks at me, Henry Clemmy, whose daughter was the girl that married my buddy Jerry Angren, the one I was told you about. He comes walking up to me, stuck his hand in, he said, "You are the luckiest son of a that ever walked." I said, "You're telling me?" I said, "I thought you had me." Then the next year, we went That team won 48 games in a row.
Wow.
They hated to see us.
Yeah.
That's my one story, but the high school stuff was okay too. But back in 1985, I didn't. Jill had got out of there and she's playing high school in Centerville, and George and Donna Woodward comes. They kept asking me a couple times, "Would you just coach them?" I said, "No, I don't want to. I don't want to.
Right.
I didn't have any blood in it."
Right.
So after the third time, I said, "All right." I said, "I'll do it for 1 year and 1 year only." Mm-hmm. And I heard there was a lot of chatter from the stands and all that stuff. So I met in the garage. I had a meeting with all the parents. I told them up front, I said, "I may not be the best coach this kid's ever had, but I won't be the worst either. But I said, to do know one thing for sure. I said, nobody is going to yell from the stands at anybody, including me. Because if I hear something coming out of the stands, I'm going to grab a kid by the arm and said, do you know who that's doing the yelling over there? I said, you better tell them to shut up or they're going out of here. I said, we'll kick them out." So anyhow, had 26 kids in Babe Ruth. And so one of them was Troy Strong. Do you remember Troy Strong?
I do remember Troy Strong, yeah.
He was a heck of an athlete. Well, anyhow, he quit. He wasn't coming out his 15th year. So I go out to Troy Strong's house. Fred and I became friends as a result. I sat there and listened to him for 30 minutes, didn't say a word about, he tell me how bad things were and this, that, and the other. And he hated this guy, he hated that guy, he didn't like this guy. I just sit there and listened. Troy sit there and he didn't say a word. Got all done, he said, "It's up to you." He said, "If you want to play for him, go ahead." "You want to play?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Okay." Comes up to me after 4 games, he said, "I'm going to quit." I said, "What?" I said, "I'm going to quit." I said, "Why?" "I want to concentrate on high school." I said, "Now listen, how many of those high school kids are going to be able to play 14 games, extra games? That's you." He was the only unanimous pick for the All-Stars. I had 5 kids on that team. Moravia had 5 kids on the All-Star team. Should have had 7. The league was good. But anyhow, I told him, Babe Ruth, I said, just 1 year, I'll do it 1 year, and I should have done it the next year, but I didn't. So, but anyhow, they went 14-0. They pulled a triple play. I'll never forget the triple play. Playing at Blakesburg, somebody hit a line shot to Troy, about shoelace high.
Yeah.
Guys off third, touch base. Guys running from second to third, throws to second. Triple play. I couldn't believe it. There was a lot of talent. That's the team that went state.
Yeah.
I don't know. In business, you try to do stuff to get yourself in the limelight.
Right.
But after a while, it don't matter. Mm-hmm. It just don't matter. And the guy that helped me put the flags in lives down the street. His mother just turned 100 years old, and we talked about flags and flagpoles and blowing down and all that stuff. And he helped me do that. I did it because we needed it, and I've seen things that we needed. Yeah. So I just did it. Right. Do I care? No, I don't care. Does it help my business? Sometimes it probably hurt my business, but that don't matter. That's not why I do it. I do it to make this place a lot better place, And if there's something that needs to be done, I always said, if you want something done, find the busiest person you can, and they'll get it done,
Talk to 18-year-old Jerry and give him advice, or maybe talk to the youth of today and give them advice. What would you say to them?
It's something that they won't believe, but if it's something that you think you want to do and you think it would work, believe in yourself and make it a dream. The subconscious mind you're telling that subconscious mind some things you shouldn't be telling it. "Oh, I don't feel good today." "No, I feel all right." I'll tell you what I did. Make yourself a plan. what do you want? What do you want in life? Is it a new car? Is it a new house? Is it an acreage? What do you want? And I can show you a book if I can find it. I did that.
Yeah.
You know, I cut out a picture of a nice house and some vehicles and that sort of thing. And you can do anything you want if you believe in it.
Right.
You know,
Right.
could I be president of the United States? I wouldn't want to
Right.
anyway. But find out what you want to do. I was 35 years old before I got in the insurance business. I wish I'd have done that right after I got out of high school.
Right.
You know, if I'd have done what I did, gotten out of high school, I thought about joining the Marine Corps. And I thought, I don't want to do that either. You know, a junior college government teacher said everybody have to serve 2 years in the military. And lots of kids in there. That was when Vietnam was going. No, not me. I'm a firm believer that everybody should serve. Everybody can do something. Even my brother, who was a diabetic. My other brother was a World War II vet. And my other brother, he could hand out towels. He could sweep floors. He could do anything, you know.
Right.
Everybody should have to serve just to find out what it's like. A friend of mine said there's two things a person should do in their lifetime. One is join the military for at least 2 years and work for yourself a year in business, and you'll find out what that's like too.
Right.
You know what that's
Right.
like. And that's the truth.
Well, Jerry, this has been amazing. I really appreciate it. This is everything that I wanted it to be when I set out to interview you.
I wrote this down that very day you first contacted me, and I sat there for an hour just going over stuff, and I thought, boy, I hope this works out so that my kids can see this, and they can come back and ask me questions. What'd you do here? You know?
Right.
Did I do some crazy stuff? Yeah, I did some crazy stuff, but I'm not going to tell you that.
Thank you for listening to Well, What Do You Know? The podcast created to tell people's stories. Everybody's got a story, and every story is worth saving.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are those of the guest and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Well, What Do You Know podcast, P Square Design, Pagitech LLC, or our sponsors. The Well, What Do You Know podcast, its parent company, and its sponsors are not responsible for any statements made by guests during the recording or publication of this episode.